I also wanted to have you come in and talk today. We've been talking a little bit all this week, but I'm not a researcher and I never understand the research. But there have been two big studies, and we've talked endlessly about the criteria changing. And I wanted to have somebody come in and weigh in on this study that got so much press earlier on in the week that they're using the word outgrow autism, and it just has me going nuts. Talk to us about this study, what it really is.
I mean, I only had a chance to read the actual study this morning and some of the press releases about it this morning. And what basically, for people who don't know, the study was published in Pediatrics Journal.
Which is a pretty reputable place.
It is indeed. But the study itself was some researchers who were looking at comorbid diagnoses of children with autism. And while they were looking at that, I believe then they were interested in how that affected diagnosis, because they noticed that a lot of children, when they were looking at their database, they noticed a lot of the children who had diagnoses of autism earlier on, who also had comorbid diagnoses, later on didn't have, or reported not to have their diagnosis of autism anymore.
And see, already we're in a place where, as this was reported in the media, nobody was talking about the fact that they were looking at comorbid.
And the researchers themselves, like the goal of they weren't actually, I don't even know if they talk about, I can't remember now because I just read it this morning, but I don't believe that the authors of the research study actually talk about outgrowing autism at all. That's very much, I think, a media interpretation. It seems like to me that they've kind of run with this and decided that children can outgrow autism.
And they really have run with it. Every media outlet that I've looked at this week that covers anything about autism, from my local television station to, you know, big programming, morning news, they've been using the word outgrow autism.
And in fact, the authors, I feel like, from just reading it this morning, I feel like the point of their study, they're talking about this comorbidity of diagnoses and looking at why some children might be losing their, or not having their diagnosis later on of autism. And their point was like, oh, if we can figure out if there's a relationship with comorbid diagnoses or what's going on when the children are being diagnosed, we can better tailor intervention or better, more reliable diagnosis or something like that. That seems like the point of what they were trying to start. And it is a starting point, but there's many, when I'm reading the study, there's a lot of things are popping into my mind about how much the media have run with this. Because first of all, the study itself is completely it totally relied on a database that was already someone else's data. They drew their information from a survey that was done in 2007. I can't remember who did the survey. I don't know if it was a government survey, but
it was a phone survey.
Yes, and basically they phoned parents, I believe, and one phone call and asked them a bunch of questions over the phone, and then they published the results or whatever of this survey. So these researchers went and took their data from that. So that automatically raises the alarm bells for me. Because it's survey data we know is not that reliable for a start. And it's secondary sourcing, like they're going to another source to pull data from instead of going and collecting their own specific data for their purposes. And there's no experimental design there. So they can't produce the rigorous results that you get from an experimental design. Really, they've got a lot of correlations going on. And correlations, I don't know if you've talked about that before.
We have not talked about correlations.
A correlation basically is when you say something is related to something, but you can't assume that there's a cause. They just happen to be occurring alongside each other, but because you're not doing any manipulation or any kind of scientific experimental manipulation, you're not able to say that one thing causes the another, you know. I'm trying to think of like a really silly example, but you know, I drink coffee every morning, and it'd be like me saying that coffee drinking causes me to do something random that I happen to do every morning at the I also happen to do in the morning, but they're just happening alongside each other at the same time. It's not, one isn't causing the other.
You can't leap to the to the idea that they're interrelated.
So There's no way that from the data that they collected that they can assume anything, really.
Right.
Okay.
But even they're saying that a little bit in the actual article,
they do.
right?
They admit that completely. Like, the authors themselves admit that. The other few things about the design and so on of this that bothered me were that they took, that when you look at the demographic kind of stuff, you notice that I think a vast majority of the parents involved were white, highly educated. They had a health insurance for at least a year, and they were about 200 or 300% above the poverty level. So it's a very narrow sample.
Right.
In my mind, it's very specific to that population of people, and we know autism affects across the board. What other things? They don't consider, none of the media coverage I know really, I don't think, considered what happened between the original diagnosis and the loss of a diagnosis.
Right.
So we have no idea whether those children had intervention or what happened to them between A and B.
I'll tell you what has driven me nuts all week long. And I've talked about this a little bit on the show, that, okay, so this phone survey, they asked them a question, did your child get a diagnosis at some point from an expert? Yes. Later on in the survey, they asked, does your child currently have... Yeah, do you think that your child currently has autism? Around 33%. I think actually last night I was looking and it was a little bit even higher than 33%. 40% said no.
Right.
And then we get all these theories that they're like, okay, well, it seems like at least a portion of them were kids who were misdiagnosed. Right. Right. We have to capture that. We're colleagues
just
with...
to stop you there, Sean, the first thing that's just popped into my mind there is they asked the parent, has anyone ever told you, as a doctor or someone else, told you that your child has a diagnosis? So they didn't do any, they just went on like the parent report. They didn't go and then check. I don't think these researchers went and definitely checked that the child had officially been given a diagnosis as well. Okay. That's the other thing. And then it's just a diagnosis generally. We don't know what proportion of the children had autism or versus Asperger's versus PDD-NOS. So all those things might affect outcome as well, and response to treatment and so on. And of course, autism is such a spectrum. We know that too. We've no information about the specifics of each child's autism or groups of children's autism and so on. Right.
So already, you know, we don't. There are things that we don't know, questions that arise from this. But okay, so you have this thing and you see this correlation. You know, whatever it is, and. But so they decide, the media decides to take a leap. Here is where I lose my mind entirely, that we know that there are studies that are out there, many studies now, that have shown that kids on the autism spectrum, if they get quality ABA therapy for a certain number of hours over a certain period of time, that a percentage of those kids, a fairly high percentage, higher than even was on this survey, will lose their diagnosis. They no longer qualify for their diagnosis. But instead of leaping to what there is science-based evidence for, and it would still be a leap to say, oh, well, maybe, and asking the question, what they leapt towards was, the media leapt and said, they must have outgrown it. That seems the most logical explanation.
It's interesting because that's the first thing that they jump to, rather than looking at maybe there's a possibility that a small percentage of the children did outgrow their diagnosis, whatever that means. Maybe there's another, but then there's all these other things, like maybe the child had intervention, maybe they were misdiagnosed. These authors in particular are looking at comorbidity. So what that means is that they're looking at the children who have an autism diagnosis and a diagnosis of some other thing.
Right.
And so what they're thinking is maybe the children, and it's not so much as misdiagnosed, but that the children with all these other things going on, those things may have been presenting autism kind of symptoms. Right. That's one possibility. So when the child grew older or they treated these other diagnoses, perhaps the autism symptoms went away. That's one possibility they talk about.
So for instance, if a child had a hearing issue, a documented hearing issue, and was diagnosed with autism, and the hearing issue got taken care of, that could explain, but again, they're totally postulating. There's no evidence.
It's complete speculation. The entire thing is total speculation, because it's just all report data. Right. So
and not even report data that was intended for this particular subject.
Exactly. It was and also it's all based on 2 questions. They only looked at 2 of the survey questions. Right. And they're very open. questions. So that's interesting to me. And then even when they're talking about the co-occurring conditions, I was just saying to Shannon in the break there, even those are very vague. Like, they talk about children who have a past speech problem and autism, and I'm thinking, well, what does a past speech problem mean? You have to have a language delay to have a diagnosis of autism. So it's kind of confusing. Or a learning disability, or they have a developmental delay, and those are such broad.
What does it mean?
That I just was kind of like, oh, what does that mean? And, it's just not very good.
But I got to say, what I feel better about having you come in is say that you know, the study was not leaping to this Outgrow, that really, for all intents and purposes, is the media. And the media drives me a little bit nuts in terms of what they'll come out with. And what I worry the most is that the takeaway for a parent hearing what the media has been talking about all week long. And we've had people commenting on the site this week, that pediatricians have said, oh, don't worry, your child could outgrow this.
Actually, that's something that occurred to me, because I've heard that before in my practice. And actually, I've heard other things, like when I've had children who have recovered and worked with those children myself, and then had later on pediatricians say, well, they would have got better anyway, they would have outgrown it anyway, that it wasn't the intervention, and that is extremely frustrating. Because we know that we don't want to leave our kids just to see what happens.
What a disservice to them.